Thanks, Scott. So today we will be highlighting the best practices and kind of the workflow for taking your Revit models and rendering different camera views and setting up some animations inside of 3ds Max. So the agenda for today is going to be how to set up the Revit model and run your exports, how to set up your renderings and make adjustments to the different materials and lighting, how to create a basic animation, and setting up a little bit about the render farms. And then following the presentation, Scott will cover some of the upcoming events with CTC, and we will answer as many questions as we possibly can. So with that, I will just go ahead and get started. And first we'll jump into Revit. So with the latest and greatest versions of Revit in the last few years, there have been some enhancements to the building design suites, in case you guys haven't already seen those. So with versions of Building Design Suite Premium and Ultimate, you get a copy of Revit and 3ds Max, and one of those settings that you are able to receive then is this nice little suites workflow menu option, which has two exporting options to go to 3ds Max Design for exterior renderings and interior renderings. And we will be highlighting some of those options. If you do not have these available because you have just a standalone version of Revit, you did not purchase it through the Building Design Suites, or it was upgraded in a different manner, and you have an individual copy of 3ds Max that you purchased separately, you are able to go ahead and export to an FBX file, and then you will be able to link that FBX file into 3ds Max in that manner, or you can send it off to someone else that can do that for you. You are also able to natively bring in a Revit model, but then all it's really doing is creating that FBX upon linking or importing into 3ds Max. So, you know, at the end of the day, you're getting the same file format just before you save as a Max file. So as far as, you know, kind of talking about the rendering aspect of this, as you all know, Revit can do the rendering. It has the mental ray rendering engine built inside of it, and you get this cute little teapot down here at the bottom, or on your view tab there, and it has all your render settings. You can change the quality, you can pick a region, adjust the resolutions a little bit, interior versus exterior, sun or no sun, and things of that nature. However, it takes quite a bit of time, especially if you're trying to get a high quality rendering, and more especially on an interior scene where you've got a lot of different lights, you've got some really reflective materials, you've got sunlight coming in from the outside. I mean, all these different variables inside of a Revit model that's already quite large probably to begin with, can take a long time to render a high quality image. So Autodesk came out with cloud rendering, which has been great. You know, it does the job a lot faster. It's all on the cloud, it's online, it doesn't soak up your computer's resources. However, there's limited settings going in that direction. You can't make as many adjustments to the lighting, or, you know, the qualities and some of the output values. You just don't have as much control as you would maybe even in Revit, definitely outside of Revit. And you know, you end up having to do a lot of tweaks inside of Photoshop or Adobe After Effects or something along those lines. And you know, with the new changes that Autodesk has made to your subscription cloud units, doing a lot of high quality renderings, you will run out of cloud units quite quickly, and either be forced to doing a whole bunch of draft renderings or purchasing additional cloud units, which, you know, no one wants to have to do if they don't. You know, you don't want to do that if you don't have to, really. So if you have 3ds Max via Building Design Suites or a separate purchase, this is going to be great for you. So I'm going to go ahead and zip out of there. So there's a couple of different things we can do. depending on the rendering that you're trying to output here, you only want to really bring in what you're going to use. So in this case, I have such a small model, I can just bring the whole thing across. But in the event that I was doing a large model and I'm not really worrying about the interior at all, I'm only focusing on the exterior, I may want to set up and turn off the interior elements that are not visible through the windows. So any interior conference rooms, offices, if you're doing healthcare, patient care rooms, operating rooms, things like that. You don't, or partial open office areas, you clear a lot of that out and just turn it off. Hopefully it's on a work set that's easily manageable and you can just close that work set. Because if it's brought in, even though it's into 3ds Max, even though it's not in the scene, you are gonna get Max will analyze that upon rendering, just like Revit does. So if you're not using all the lights, don't bring them all in. Only bring in what you need. Okay, so you can set up multiple 3D views for that. Okay, with a bunch of different visibility settings taken care of. Again, because this is a small file, I am not going to worry about that. Okay, so I've just created a couple of different camera angles here. Got an exterior one, I've got an interior one. Once it fires up. So depending on what view I'm in, when I do my suites workflow, it's going to bring that camera in. If I was just in the overall 3D model and say, for example, did the export out to exterior, interior, it would bring both cameras in this case. If I just did an FBX out, it would bring in all the cameras. So I get a whole bunch of different cameras that I wouldn't necessarily need, and it could be a little, it might be a little messy getting in there just because you have so much going on. So in this case, what I would do is I'll just switch to my exterior view, and through my suites workflow option here, I will select an exterior rendering for 3ds Max. Now really, there is no major difference between these two. I highly recommend expanding the settings every single time. When it comes to file linking and updating existing files, I always like to be prompted to say, well, I want to generate a new file, or I want to update an existing one. That way, you're not expected to know that right out of the gate, and you don't have to worry about creating all these different settings files, which you can do. So I like to always be prompted, and I always bring in my Max, use the Max scene material definitions, and anything that I've changed in Max, I want to maintain those when I update it with another version of the Revit file. Now, this is the important part down here, is this include by type. Lights, daylight, cameras, helpers, auto smooth. Since it is an exterior scene, by default it doesn't want to bring the lights through. And that's fine, because I'm going to do a daylight rendering. I don't necessarily need my interior lights to be present. So I'm okay with that. But if I want to use the same model to do both interior and exterior lighting or renderings, I will want to include those lights, because the transition between Revit and 3ds Max for lighting has gotten better over the years. 3 years ago, no, 4 years ago, it wasn't that great. So now I am going to bring that along with. My daylight system, I am not going to bring along with. I have found that over the years it involves too many different edits and tweaks to different multipliers and shading and environment variables and all this extra stuff. It's not worth it. I want my cameras. The create helper at origin, that is literally just a UCS icon that is nice to have potentially. I'm not going to bring it in, and I like auto smoothing on my face, on my adjacent faces. When it comes to combining your entities, I like combining them by material or not at all. So I like to have some of that flexibility moving into 3ds Max. Some of you may not. So if you do it by Revit material, for example, all of my brick on the exterior of the building are all going to be kind of associated with that material. So if I want to change the brick globally, I only have to change that one material and I'm good to go. I can combine, and then all my objects are kind of grouped that way in a sense as well, so I can grab all my walls at the same time. I can do it by category, so Revit category, in which case category of walls, or doors, regardless of what the material is. Family type, same thing, brought in as one massive object. That isn't going to give you a whole lot of extra flexibility. The other option that I would choose from is do not combine, where it's all just kind of individual objects, individual materials. I can do whatever I want to whatever I want. So, there has been a couple of questions that have popped in that I feel like I should answer right now before we get too far away from it. As far as how many megabytes is small for a file size, a lot of that depends on the computer, unfortunately. As far as Revit file sizes go, obviously 20 megabytes is small. On most typical Revit projects, from my experience, if your file is 200 megabytes or less, you're doing really good. I guess small in that respect then would be like 125, 130 and under. I would consider that small. But if you have a computer that's 3-4 years old, that might be getting in the mid-range. 150 might be a medium size. And that might be a large file for your firm. It all depends on what you're doing. If it's a house, it might only be 50 megs. If it's a hospital, you might have 5 300 megabyte files, just for architectural. I mean, it really depends on the work that you're doing and how much information is being requested of you to put into the models as well. So what I'm going to do here is I would hit run, but I'm not going to sit here and wait for that to happen. But what would happen is it would go ahead and launch 3ds Max for me with my model as is. Okay, and it brought my cameras in for me, and I can now navigate around inside of 3ds Max. For this particular file, the whole process in itself took about 2 minutes. So it really wasn't all that bad. And it brought my cameras in, and I can go ahead and switch to these cameras at any time. Here's that exterior view. Here's an interior view that I had saved. And at any time, I can create my own. So what I'm going to do is first just switch back to just a typical ortho view and navigate around just a touch. And so what I can do right now, if I want to, just a quick test, I could hit render and verify that my exterior lighting's good. Well, currently I don't have any daylight because I told it not to come in. So it's going to be a little dark, and it's going to use kind of this default light that 3ds Max gives you, which cannot be adjusted, and it's going to look a little flat. So what I'm going to do first is create a daylight system, which is your sunlight. So I'm going to go to I'll move this little toolbar out of the way, go to my my little design panel over here and create a daylight system. And this can really be kind of placed wherever you want. It gives you this compass and a little sun object here. So what I can do now is, with this selected, I do a number of different things. One, I can rotate my compass and determine what the east-west axis needs to be. And I can be generic with it. I can just manually rotate how I see fit. Or I can come down here and define an accurate angle set. Maybe I need it to be at negative 32 degrees. And then I get that. That's an actual rotation then. And then I can go ahead and grab the sun object here and go through my modify panel over here and actually define the time of day, what month, day, and year it is, and I can actually define a location based off of the kind of general map of popular cities in the United States or North America, but I can go to any of the other continents. And if your city is not listed, or the city that you want to choose is not listed, you can just go ahead and physically type in what the latitude and longitude of the position of the building needs to be, and it will update and give you the accurate kind of sun angle settings based on the time of day. All right. Another thing that you're going to want to do is Make sure that your what's called an orbital scale is high enough. Sometimes when you place these things, they end up at being like 10 feet. So really your sun icon here is no larger or no higher up than the top of your door. So really it's not going to do you any favors. So what I like to do is usually make it around at least 1,000 feet. 500 is probably fine as long as it's above the building. I like to just throw it up there because we can. It doesn't kill anything to do that. Okay. So now that I've done that, I've got my location defined here. Um, sure, we'll do 11 a.m. And what's today's date? September 3rd. Okay, so it's going to adjust the sun angle a little bit there as well. Oops. And I've got 2. That's awesome. So I can actually just go ahead and delete one. And there it is, delete. So here's the one I just made. So if I want to, if you want to get really specific with this, you do have the ability to bring in a weather data file that you can find online, and it can map everything up automatically for you that way based off time of year, time of day. You can do your solar studies based on that and animate those things, which I'm kind of going to briefly show you a little bit here at the end, sort of. So, all right. So now that I've got that in place, what I can do now is switch to my camera view. And at this point, I can render it, right? You get your simple render teapots up here, just like you had in Revit. I like using the shortcuts. I had F9. And in this case, what I ended up with, and I forgot to pre-open this, so I apologize, but they are right here. This is kind of the stock image that you get, and all I did was add a daylight system, right? So I brought all my materials in. And this is exactly how it would have looked in Revit, yet this only took about 3 minutes. And in Revit, who knows how long that would have taken. Longer than 3 minutes. Not too bad on an exterior rendering. What's nice about Max, though, is I have the ability to really increase the settings and enhance them and make adjustments to my lighting and all these different things and kick out another rendering really fast. And I'm not blowing any cloud units on this, potentially. And I'm going to get a higher quality earlier on. So I will come back into 3ds Max and kind of show you some of these changes. One of the things that I like to do first and foremost with any model that I bring to 3ds Max is adjust my exposure value, my EV. Okay, by default, when you first create your daylight system, it sets this to 15. I like to scale it down a couple of clicks, 12, 13, oops, not that many clicks, 12 or 13. And the next image I'm going to show you, I set it down to a 13, and that was it. And it really brightened it up and kind of made it look a little bit more crisp and defined the shadows a little bit better. No, I didn't change any materials, but so that was a quick thing that I did. I rendered it again. It took another 3 minutes. And so far, it's been pretty straightforward. It's been pretty easy to do. But what we can get into next is start adjusting some of these materials. So I can open up my materials editor or my material, and I like using the older interface better. There is this slate material editor that gets into, the material sets and wiring different image files to it and bump patterns and textures and making adjustments that way. I'm not a big fan of it personally. I guess you can call me an old school Max user. I like using the good old compact material editor where I see everything right there in front of me. I get my preview image right out of the gate, and I'm more familiar with it. So what I can do is go find that brick material. So in your material browser, all your Revit materials have come in. Okay. One of the kickers to remember here is that when you export any file out of Revit, in your temp folder, on your user's temp folder, on your C drive, buried all nice and deep in there, is where a folder with the file name of your project .fbm is listed. And this is where all of the materials that were used inside of Revit get exported to. Okay, so since I'm doing this locally on my machine, everything's going to work fine, right? No matter what, because I'm the only one that's rendering this. But if I wanted to put this out there for someone else to render, they would get slews of missing material warnings simply because they don't have access to look at my temp folder on my C drive. So what I would need to do is move those to the network somewhere in a shared location that everyone has access to, and to have them adjust their pathing so that they can see it as well. Where's my brick? Here's my brick. So if I drag and drop this into one of my empty slots here, we'll do it as an instance so that whatever I change here automatically gets applied back to the max models. Now I'm going to go ahead and quickly find this. Oop, wrong one. And I can change what the brick material is actually pulling from. You get tons of different images and to choose from. Here's that file path. So it's in my user folder, app.local temp, the file name, and it throws my username in there because it's a local file. And then here's that interior front entry FBM folder. This is where all of these scene materials came in. So if I wanted to pick something else, for example, I want to change it to a leather for some reason, I could. In this case, I'm just going to go ahead and not use these. I'm going to switch out to the out of the box stuff, which is buried in your program files x86 folders, and it's all shared data between Revit and 3ds Max, so it's the same material library that they would have gotten in either location. I can go ahead and find something. Let's go look for, that. That works for me. So I'll bring that in, okay? Instantly it updates, and I can go ahead and run a quick rendering, see what I think. Now, there needs to be some changes made to this, simply because if you look at it, it's just using some of the out-of-the-box settings, and it needs some serious love as far as the scaling and the offsetting of such. And I can zoom in on this a little bit here from a ortho view. It's crisp, it's clean, looks good, but the pattern's almost too obviously repeated. So, you could try to adjust the scale of the image file a little bit, but you don't want to go too far because it may make the stone tiles look a little large. What I typically recommend doing is bringing this into Photoshop and making the seam a little less noticeable. And if any of you are familiar with Photoshop, it's doable. And you can go ahead and create custom bump patterns and texture patterns out of Photoshop as well, and embed those into your Max materials for use later on to enhance the file a little bit. I'm not going to worry about that. Honestly, I don't have Photoshop installed on this particular computer anyway, so I'm just going to leave it as is for now. Okay, and then if I wanted to, I can just, if I knew, I know the rest of the building looks good. If I just wanted to quickly take a look at this, I can open up my render setup dialog box and switch to oh yeah, there it is. I'm just going to switch to region and adjust how much I want to see here, because I only really care about seeing what the pattern of my stone is going to look like when rendered. So I'll do that. I'll just quickly zoom in, quickly adjust it real quick, and render it. Okay. I just want to get a feel for it, see how it renders, see if it's clean. Does it seem really obvious? Shouldn't take all that long. It doesn't look terrible. I didn't exactly adjust my output size at all, which I could have done here. We get a whole slew of different lens options. I can switch to an HD TV video format, which gives me really high resolution. You can always customize it and do something even bigger. Render it out for an IMAX if you wanted to at a 70mm lens. So you really have a lot of flexibility and a lot of options to choose from. I like starting out small. 640 by 480, yes, it's small, but it gives you a good idea of what you're going to get. And it's quick. You can adjust other different settings to make the rendering quality even much better. but it's quick and easy, and you know, gets the point across for samples. Okay, so 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 I've made a few changes there, and it's pretty straightforward. And now if the Revit model is still being worked on, I can continually run through that suites workflow and update this model and not lose any of the changes that I've made to this. It's going to maintain these updates, and make adjustments to modeled objects as necessary, so that I'm staying up to date with what everybody else is doing. And I don't even have to close the file if I don't want to. Okay. So what I'm going to do now, real quick, is switch to my interior scene here. And again, I can run through my renderings. If I just did a quick, hit F9, did a quick rendering, I would get something along the lines of this. Not very nice. And that's because, a lot of the different settings have been enabled. One of the things that's the primary cause of this is the fact that the exposure value is still set to 13, which is meant for an exterior shot. If I dumb this down to, say, a 9 or even a 10, you can start to go ahead and run more sample renderings based off that to get an idea of what's happening. Okay, so you get a better quality rendering quickly, and that one should be this one. So this is set to an exposure value of 9. Okay, it's not fantastic. Obviously I need it to make additional edits to other materials. My light is still a little intense up here, so there's still some work to be done. I've got a little noise on the TV screen back there. Okay, so maybe an 8 is what I want. And maybe I'm sick and tired of hitting F9 every single time I make a change. So what you can do is you do have this option to hit a render preview, and it goes through the same process of rendering everything as you had before, with all the different settings that you have made in the render setup and the global illumination, final gather, and those are just different ways that Max calculates light bounces, and some ambient lighting and such. It processes through all that, and then kind of gives you an idea of what the preview is going to look like. And as long as you're not making any drastic adjustments, it's going to go ahead and it'll update automatically. So if I change this, you can see it's starting to get a little brighter, a little bit more washed out. And in this case, oh, I didn't update this, right? I didn't get my lights. So lucky you guys get to see how this works. So I'm going to run this export, and it's going to prompt me to update my scene. So while we're waiting for this, there's another question that came in regards to, there it is, we'll do that one, the materials. So Revit's lack of UVW consistency in the 3ds Max is kind of annoying. I'll give you that. So one of the things is that you're going to have that issue. Oops, I just went to the wrong spot. They haven't really gotten any better with it over the years. I still end up having to either make adjustments to the scale inside of 3ds Max or applying one of my UVW map modifiers to the content, and it's a little bit annoying, to be perfectly honest. I haven't noticed much changes other than some of the custom edits that I've made to the materials inside of Revit have held on a little bit better inside of 3ds Max. But because 3ds Max analyzes things a little differently as far as the geometry than Revit does, it's still going to be an issue, and it's probably going to be an ongoing issue for a little while yet, unfortunately. And in regards to Revit MEP, there is self-illumination options, and you can still utilize that data inside of 3ds Max. As the last model that I had open, this other file, all of these light fixtures are set up to self-illuminate. They don't currently have a light source in there because they didn't come through. So those render previews that you saw there, That's all self-illuminated. So there is a possibility to do that and adjust some of those settings, whether it's inside of Revit or inside of 3ds Max. You don't necessarily have to have a light source placed. You're going to get more accurate shading and lit lights on the floors and such if you use the traditional lights, whether it's from Revit or 3ds Max. Um, it, it, and it works. They've made a change to the lights so that now if you modify one, if it's the same fixture family, it updates all of them now. Whereas in years past, if you had 10 of the same light, you had to modify each source individually. You don't have to do that anymore. So it's and the next part gets into animation of Max objects. If I have time, I will show you how to animate an object that is not the sun. So I think this is done. It is. So one of the things that I like to do with my lights is first make sure they're on. There's a great tool in here called Light Lister. And Light Lister gives you a list of every single light that is currently in, excuse me, I've got a bit of a cold, that's currently in this Max model that came from within Revit. And in this case, by default, they were all set to be turned off. So I can simply check a box here now, and it turns them all on, which is great. And I can make additional adjustments to them here as well, like adjusting the intensity and the color, what types of shadows should it be casting, things of that nature. I can adjust my sun and my sky here as well. Okay, so all I wanted to do is make sure they were on for now. Okay, so now they are. Let's back up a bit. I can now grab this particular guy, and I wanted to show you some of the settings that can be adjusted if you don't like the way the lights work. So expanding my modify panel here a little bit, maybe hopefully make it a little easier for you guys to see. I have the ability to verify that it's on here as well. That it's casting shadows and what types of shadows, and how the light distribution is working. So currently it's set up to a uniform diffuse. I could set it to be a spotlight, uniform spherical, or I can do a photometric web light, which then allows me to specify some type of light sourced file, like an IES file, or something along those lines. Okay, so I can pull in specific lighting manufacturer data so that I'm getting the most accurate representation of the light as I possibly can. In the event that you don't have those, you have the ability to adjust the coloring and the temperature and the lumens, what the resulting intensity might be, and what the emitting light from the shape-wise is, how big that's going to be, what radius, length and width, things of that nature. So what I'm doing here is I'm just checking a box to use the far attenuation, and that just enhances, expands the light out a little bit further than it would normally. And a lot of these things, if you're just trying to get it, use it early on stages for more of a schematic-y, early stages of development to kind of prove to the client that this is somewhat what it's going to look like, but not maybe 100% yet, because we may want to change a few materials and adjust the lights a little bit. You can just start checking some of these boxes, adjusting the settings to kind of make it look how you would like it to look, and then come back later on and do some more analysis on it to get exactly what you need in there. Okay, so those are kind of some basic settings that I've done. I changed my exposure value down to a 9, and then here it looks a little washed out, and that's kind of to be expected. It just it's showing a lot of reflectivity, and with the exposure value set up as high as it is, it's going to look like this until I run the rendering, in which case this is what it looks like then. At those settings, and that's exactly what I changed to acquire this image. Okay. Now, so what I would do next is, there's the bad light. So what I would do next here is I would go ahead and maybe make my reception desk walls here less reflective. Maybe I want to change the carpeting. Maybe I want to put a picture on the TV so it actually shows up with something. Change the wall. Right now, I think that's just wood paneling. So that might be a little too reflective there as well. Too much light, dumb it down a little bit. Maybe adjust the intensity. Um, so there's a whole slew of different things you can do. And if it helps, you can just switch back to a shaded mode, so it doesn't seem as washed out, and you can still kind of gauge what's going on here. You can create custom materials here to quickly check and see if it's something you want to do. Go back, make the adjustment later on. So in this case, I can grab an empty slot, for example, hit get material, and either, what I'm going to do in this case is start with my carpet. Okay, I'll bring it in, and then instead of using what's here, I'm just going to switch out to something else. Okay, maybe I want to use whatever that is. I'm not even sure what that is, but we're going to use it anyway. And just to see. So I'll come back to here. It should have updated. I can run a quick sample rendering real quick, or I can switch back to realistic, tell it to display just my default lights, and still not showing up. And this will happen from time to time. There's this little button here called Show Shaded Material in the Viewport. You can go ahead and click on that, and it'll actually show that material now instead of you having to go back and render it. Okay, so at least you kind of get an idea of what it is that you just put in there if you weren't quite clear on what the image actually was. So this makes it really easy for me to go browse out now. Maybe I want wood floor. I missed it. Yep, and it updates right away. And this is where we can start getting into adjusting the scale a little bit more. Maybe I want this to be 2-inch wide by hold on, but 6 inches long. And, it's going to go ahead and start adjusting it. It's going to be, it's not even really updating all that much. That's wonderful. Well, that's the idea here. In the event where it's not really doing a whole heck of a lot for you, we can add what are called modifiers to the floors, which will adjust how things are scaled and wrapped. I alluded to the UVW mapping, which is one of the questions that came up. We can apply a UVW map modifier to our floor, for example, and make additional adjustments to the way the materials are being placed and overlaid on top of our objects here. And it's all the way down here at the bottom. So you would go ahead and add UVW map, and you can change between planar, cylindrical, spherical, box, adjust the length, width, and the height of the UVW tiling, and make adjustments to how it's aligned and what kind of orientation. And these are really good tools, for brick on a wall that wraps the corner, for example. Or if you had some type of concrete on a parking lot light post, the concrete tends to start to twist at the top. And if using a modifier like this, you can clean that up, and it actually looks, legitimate. So, and for now, I'm just going to delete that. Okay. So these are some of the basic, good starting points to get you rolling as far as getting some of the rendering going, making adjustments to your lights, changing some of the materials, finding scene materials that are already there that came from Revit, editing those, watching it update live on your screen. So once you kind of get an idea of what you want, so say I was happy with this for some reason. What I could do now is start to increase all my settings. So if I go to my render setup dialog box, which I usually hit F10 for that, otherwise it's this button right there. I like to go ahead and start to adjust my output size. Go ahead and pick a lens type and what the resolution of that needs to be. Then I go ahead and I'll switch maybe to my global illumination tab and start increasing some of my final gather precision settings. Instead of just a draft, which is the basic, bump it up to low or medium. You start going any higher than that, you're not going to really notice the changes as much, and it's going to take significantly longer to render. If you need to, go ahead, but you don't necessarily need to do that as much. And then you can go ahead and start slightly adjusting some of the rays per final gather point and what the initial density of this is going to be. You can come down here and start messing with caustics and photon mapping, but this will add some significant time to the rendering process as well. If you are going to do that, I would highly recommend that you keep your output size smaller, so that when you jack up your your different settings and final gather and caustics and photons, that it's not going to try to render it on a 1900 by 1200 pixel resolution. 640 by 480 is good for running tests like that. Okay, so those are some basic settings that you can make an adjustment to and notice the difference, quite quickly. And because I don't have 30 minutes potentially to let this render, I don't know how long this one would take. I'm not going to run it, but these are some really basic settings that you can pull up. I like doing the HD one at a 1920 by 1080. Okay, so one of the other things I wanted to show you before I run out of time, and this is something else that you can do now that we've got our model in here. I've got a sun object in here. I can do a really, really quick kind of shadow study out of this. Okay, so if I grab my sun object and on my motion tab, I can go ahead and set my, the start time, let's say, to be 5 a.m. Okay, and I can go ahead now and lock that in at a spot. And if I want, I can drag my slider all the way to the end, change the time to be somewhere over here, and hit another key spot there. And this actually animates that sun object. Okay, so what I can do is, with all of my lighting and shadows displayed, we can go ahead and make adjustments to these things. And come on, don't fail me now. And I might have to make some adjustments to some of this intense. Oh, you know what? I forgot to change exposure value. We're washing everything out. There we go. That looks a little better. So depending on, you can go ahead and pick whatever angle that you want, either in my, your orthographic 3D view, and drag the slider and see what the shadows are going to look like. Okay, I can switch to my exterior camera view here and do the same thing. I can just drag it to different points, see what the shadows are going to do against the building. Okay, I can also switch to, an interior scene and get the same effect. Here, I'm not going to notice anything simply because there are no windows except for the front door. So what I think I'll do real quick is switch to a top view. I'm going to place a camera. Hopefully we'll be able to see this. I suppose I should probably turn my wireframe on. And there we go. Here's that new camera I placed. Now I can go ahead and move it around so that it's in an area where I may actually see some shadows. And I'm going to now switch to a front elevation. And it always puts it down kind of at the ground plane. So I need to make sure that I move this whole puppy up to the appropriate location, which just happens to be the 4th floor. And that looks close. We'll call it good for now. And we'll switch back to a shaded view. And look at that. Love it. So this is where I would need to go ahead and make adjustments to different things. So I can switch to a multi-viewport format and go to one of my top views where I can still see the camera that I just got done placing and move it. So I can move it around and it will update live on the other screen here. And I can also adjust where my target position is in the event that, you know, you need to adjust what you're looking at. So I can do that, get a better idea. Excuse me. All right, here we go. So now I'll switch back to this view, maximize that viewport. I have the ability to kind of change this sort of field of depth a little bit. You know, it kind of starts to skew things in tunnel vision. So maybe not so much. That looks a little better. And I can switch to realistic again. It's going to be kind of dark, but you can kind of start to see shadow coming in. Make sure that my lighting is set up to use scene lights here. Shadows are on. And I can go ahead and start adjusting my slider in. And, you know, in this case, I'll just make this adjustment. And it's pretty dark now. If I go back this way, I get a little bit more evening sunlight spewing into the windows here. There's a play button for this, so I could play this. I can export this out to an AVI file just kind of as is, or I can batch render this and set up a render farm and distribute this across pretty much as many computers as you want. I believe one network license of 3ds Max can farm out to up like 1,000 computers or something like that, or 999, or so. You know, you could pretty much do this on everybody's computer, assuming that their computer is powerful enough to run this. And the process for that is to with every installation of 3ds Max, there's a little add-on product called Autodesk Backburner, and in most cases that gets installed automatically as well, and you kind of have to go out of your way to not install it. But the process is that you pick a computer to be the render manager. In this case, my machine, and you get this little dialog box, and you go ahead and set it up. Set it up to say who the manager's computer. You know, my computer's the manager. I can pick my open up specific ports. It's always recommended to use the defaults, but if you can't use the defaults, pick whatever you want. And there's that. Now I can also, then I would go to other computers. Like I went to my training rooms, and I have 2 computers added to my list here, number 13 and number 28. And they've already communicated. Notice that it said, hey, we've got an issue here, and that's because when I was moving around earlier today, I disconnected from the network and lost my connection. Didn't see them anymore. Okay, and then so the server part is what each individual workstation would have to have running to be able to read the jobs that are being output by the manager. In this case, if I want my computer to run as well, I can set it up so that my computer is reading me, the local host, and it'll go ahead now, and it'll also start accepting jobs as well. So it's going to render at the same time. The monitor portion of this just allows you to manage and visually see what computers are doing what. Oops, I connected to the wrong computer. So we'll do a connect again. I should be able to just type in localhost. It shows the 3 computers that are available, including my own. And if I had a job submitted, it would start processing this right now. To submit that job inside of 3ds Max, ooh, the graphics are going. You go to the, yes, here it is, the rendering menu, and there is a batch render setting. So you click on that, and this allows you to go ahead and add the job, sets it up, you pick the view that you want to render, what camera, in this case it's rendering my current viewport, which is fine. I can go ahead and define output paths, where I want everything to be saved, different presets and settings that I've defined, and then you do a net render. Okay, so in this case it's going to do a single frame, right? So I don't necessarily want that. So I come back to my render setup menu inside of Max. I have the ability to do the current time set, which is 0 to 100. I can be selective here. I can pick and choose what I want to run with, and or be explicit and kind of build like a mini slideshow of sorts. Okay, so I'll do that. I can define output paths here as well, which can be overridden later on. In this case, I'm just going to leave it. And from back then in my Where did it go? I think this is it. Yep. I will just delete it, start it again, and it's not picking it up. Bummer. In any case, it would show up here, and I would be able to go ahead and I can effectively override this preset and say start at 0, end at 100. Rename the view if I would like, define my output path, which you should do. And in your output path, what I typically recommend doing here is, I never like setting this up to kick out the actual AVA file. I always tell it to, I always kick out PNGs or BMP image files or something along those lines, simply because I don't want to be reliant on 3ds Max kicking out an AVI file that I can't really do anything with. You know, maybe I want to put some additional effects inside of this, or maybe one of my images is bad because the material didn't render properly. So now otherwise now I have to go back and kick out a new AVI file instead of just modifying image number 36. So I always recommend doing this. Save it to a folder somewhere. And now I can hit render, and it's going to create the job. Go ahead and connect it to the host, or basically to myself. All my computers should be there, and it didn't see me apparently. Well, it should. What did I do? Maybe I've got too many things running at this point. I've got like 18 programs open. We should try that again. In which case it would find my computer, and then I could go ahead and submit the job, and great. Wonderful. Anyway, it works, I promise. And it would go ahead and create this, set it up, and then there's this monitor portion that you see here. The job would then show up here, and it would automatically, these other computers would start picking up the frames that it needed to render, and it would just be on a first come, first serve basis. Then at the end of the process, after all 100 frames are rendered, one of the 3 computers here would then stitch it all together and create, remove any overlaps or anything like that. And then I can use the RAM player inside of 3ds Max to stitch this all together, and put sound over to it, put some different fading effects in it, or bring it into a program like Adobe Premiere or Windows Movie Maker and go ahead and piece up my final presentation that way. So that concludes my presentation here. So we'll just kind of go back here and get through the rest of these questions. All right, so in 3ds Max, is the best approach to use state sets for the animation of 3ds Max objects? I'm not 100% sure on this. I would like to say yes. Yes, but don't hold me to that. It's been a long time since I've actually done anything that's specific with animation of objects. Lately it's just been animating a door for a walkthrough. I always stitch, like I just got done saying, the second half of this question is, as an alternate, I've thought about just stitching the AVIs together. That works as well. If it's, as far as creating these different presets, if all the settings are the same, and different shading, and you're not worried about how different objects need to be, excluded or included from different things, yes, you go ahead, use it, you should be fine. I like kicking out separate AVIs or BMPs and stitching them all together after the fact anyway. So another question that has come up is, as a family developer for manufacturers, what does CTC or can family developers do to make rendering in Max or Revit smoother for the end users? Um, well, Max is always going to be smoother than rendering in Revit just out of the gate. But now, some of the elements that are in Revit, specifically like a canned light, for example, is made up of, when exported into 3ds Max, is made up of some 500 faces. There's nothing we can do about that in Revit short of modeling a box for your canned light or a hexagon or something along those lines, which isn't really what you're looking for. But in 3ds Max, there's a couple of modifiers here, and I can show you sort of. There are, switch back to, did I lock it up? There are modifiers here that can add called, come on, called Turbo Smooth, or no, maybe no, I'm sorry, Pro Optimizer, which simplifies the content either based off a percentage to remove a bunch of the faces. Now the object looks a little goofy, but as long as that kind of base profile that what's visible looks okay from whatever distance you're trying to see it from, you have nothing to worry about. And I would actually recommend doing that. So, so as far as a Revit side of things goes, as long as any content developer or CTC for that matter, make sure that the content that you're receiving is not bloated in file size. Like you're not, working with a bunch of 1.5 to plus megabyte Revit families that you're inserting all over the place. And not trying to use a lot of curved geometry where not needed. Is kind of the best practice as far as getting something that's specifically for good rendering quality. If it's baseboard trim, for example, and you build your profile to have all these nice bevels and curves and reveals into it, yet when you render it, you're standing 50 feet away from it, there is absolutely zero need to have that information in there for as far as rendering is concerned. So when you're going about building that content, don't put it in. If you're not going to see handles on your doors, don't put them on. If you don't care, even better. If you need to see it, keep it simple. Do just a cylinder of sorts, maybe round the edges a touch, but don't go nuts. It might be easiest in some cases just to model it inside of the 3ds Max model itself. And that would be in both cases, Revit and 3ds Max. Another thing is lights. That's a big one, is lights. If it's not visible in the scene and the light itself has no effect on what you're rendering, turn them off. Revit, you can create light groups based off areas of the building or based on rooms, and you can turn off the entire group and the sources themselves do not render. 3ds Max, same kind of thing, except you're going through Light Lister and you're turning things off that way. So you just, as long as, if this box isn't checked, this light will no longer be processed during the rendering. Okay, the more lights you have, the longer this is going to take, regardless. So, it's just a lot of it's being mindful of what the end result is, lighting wise and content wise. If it's not up close and personal, remove detail. The last question that I'm seeing, there's two. Do the edits made in 3ds Max transfer back into Revit after they are made? Unfortunately, they do not. Revit to 3ds Max is a one-way road. So anything that you do change as far as materials, lights, anything like that, you physically have to go back and put them into Revit yourself, which is a little unfortunate. But the translation between the objects and some of the way things are analyzed is different, and I can't imagine it'd be very good if they let us anyway. So finally, can you render on the cloud from 3ds Max? Not through the Autodesk Subscription Center cloud setup. That is meant for Revit and I believe AutoCAD products. Rendering in 3ds Max, because you do have the ability to farm it out and create your own, in a sense, super rendering setup, which is exactly what Autodesk did on the cloud for you. There's no need at this point. Maybe in the future, but at this time, I haven't heard anything. So it's currently just on your current on your local machine or on your network if you've got a farm set up. So, and I believe that answered all the questions that have come in. So now I'm going to jump back into the PowerPoint here and let Scott take us home. There we go. And we did that, and here we are.